There comes a moment when heaven leans forward, not with rage, not with noise, but with a silence so thick it unsettles the air itself. A silence that doesn't mean nothing is happening, it means everything is about to. For days, months, years, wrong was done in plain sight, the innocent endured, the cruel walked freely, prayers rose like smoke from the hearts of the broken, and still God waited, not because he didn't hear, but because he is patient beyond what we deserve. But patience has a purpose, and when that purpose is complete he stands, and when God stands nothing else does. This is not about revenge, this is not about anger, this is the turning of tides. Watch what happens when God says enough. The silence before the storm, there is a silence that doesn't come from peace. It comes from restraint, from power being held back, not because it is weak, but because it is waiting. Waiting with purpose, waiting with eyes wide open. That's the kind of silence God often moves in. Not thunder, not lightning, not vengeance at first strike, but a quiet so deep, so deliberate, it almost feels like the injustice is winning. Like evil has gone unnoticed. Like the prayers of the hurting have somehow gotten lost on their way to heaven. But they haven't. They never have. You see, when God is silent, he's not absent. When he is still, he is not idle. The Creator does not slumber. He watches every moment, every tear, every betrayal. He measures every wound not in pain, but in purpose. And when the silence stretches out long enough, something begins to stir behind the curtain of time. You don't hear it at first. No one does, because divine justice never arrives with noise. It arrives with precision. It is in this silence, the long drawn-out pause, that God begins to draw a line, not with rage, but with finality, that moment when he says, "This far, no further," when his mercy, endless as it is, stops extending toward those who mock it, and his justice begins to descend. It doesn't matter how untouchable someone feels, how high they've climbed, how many voices cheered them on while they stood on the backs of the faithful. Because when God says enough, the height of the tower only makes the fall more complete. But before that fall comes the storm, and before the storm comes the silence. You've seen it, you've felt it, that pause in the air before something changes, that pressure in your spirit when you can't explain it, but you know something is shifting. The people who hurt you the most seem untouched. They laugh while you cry. They win while you break. And you've asked yourself, where is God in all of this? Why is he letting this happen? Why is he silent when you need him to speak? But what if I told you, his silence was never him ignoring you. It was him preparing everything, because the storm God sends isn't a temper tantrum. It's a calculated reordering of what was broken. It's truth rising where lies once ruled. It's a shaking of the ground that looked so steady under the feet of the wicked. And yes, it comes slowly, because mercy delays justice, because grace pleads with the ungrateful for one more chance to turn back. But when that chance runs out, the silence ends. You see, some people mistake God's patience for weakness. They keep going, keep manipulating, keep hurting others, keep building kingdoms on cruelty, and they think because there's no lightning from the sky, they've gotten away with it. But divine silence is not divine permission. It's a warning with a ticking clock, a space for repentance, a moment to look in the mirror before the mirror shatters. And when it shatters, everything changes. So many of us have been on the other end of that silence. We were the ones praying through it, crying into pillows through it, smiling for the world while collapsing inside through it. And still nothing happened, no justice, no change, just the same cycle again and again. But even in that pain, something else was happening. We were being refined, because while God was silent to the world, he was speaking to you, not always in words, but in strength, in endurance, in teaching you how to survive the storm before it even came. So when the silence breaks, when the storm rolls in, you don't crumble, you rise. That's what the silence was for. Because make no mistake, when God says enough, It's not only to stop the enemy, it's to lift the faithful. It's to take everything that was stolen from you and put it back in your hands, not in the form of revenge, but of restoration. Not to feed your ego, but to fulfill your purpose. That's why it's so hard to understand the silence until it's over. That's why faith feels like madness when you're in it, because you're believing for something no one else sees. You're trusting in a justice that hasn't arrived yet. You're holding on to a God who seems quiet, but you know deep down he's not done, and that knowing, that still burning knowing, is what carries you through the silence. When mercy steps aside, mercy is the language of heaven. It is the gentle force that has held back storms, softened justice, and embraced even those who least deserved it. Mercy is what kept the doors open for the stubborn, what gave the cruel a second chance, what whispered hope into the ears of those who mocked it. It is not weakness. Never mistake it for that. Mercy is strength under control. It is power clothed in patience. It is the outstretched hand of a God who could strike, but chooses to wait. And yet there comes a time when even mercy must step aside, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of righteousness. For too long, the wicked mistake God's silence for indifference. They assume because consequences haven't arrived, they never will. They continue building their towers on the backs of the weary, trampling hearts, breaking spirits, all the while smiling, thinking they are blessed, favored, untouchable. They confuse divine mercy with approval. But mercy is not a blank check. It has a limit, not because God is limited, but because he is just. And justice is never rushed, but it is never denied either. There is a sacred point in the life of every oppressor, every deceiver, every destroyer of hearts, where mercy bows its head and steps aside, and behind it stands a force they never thought would rise. Justice, it doesn't knock, it doesn't negotiate, it arrives, and when it does, there is no place to run, no excuse to give, no mask to wear, because when mercy steps aside, masks fall off, the truth steps into the light. The lies unravel in front of the very people they once deceived, and the ones who walked with false confidence begin to tremble, not because someone stood up to them, but because God did. When mercy steps aside, time runs out, and you begin to see something extraordinary happen. The same people who were once laughed at, the ones who forgave too much, trusted too long, believed too deeply, they are no longer crying, no longer begging. Something shifts in them, not because they have grown bitter, but because heaven has stepped in. Mercy was keeping the door open, but when that door closes, it is not the innocent who are locked out, it's the unrepentant who are sealed in. You must understand this. God does not take pleasure in wrath. He is not like us. He doesn't rage or lash out. When he acts, it's not emotional. It's eternal. It is a judgment so exact, so perfectly timed, that even the guilty cannot argue. And when he decides mercy has done all it could, he removes it, not with cruelty, but with finality. There are no more chances, no more warnings, no more signs, only consequences. This is when the winds change. This is when the proud lose sleep. This is when the voice that once echoed through their lies goes silent. The silence of mercy withdrawn is louder than thunder. It unsettles the soul. And in that stillness they know the protection they mistook for luck was actually grace. The delay they called divine absence was divine patience. And now that patience has ended, and what of the wounded during all this? What happens to those who endured and kept silent? The ones who said nothing while their hearts were broken, who kept praying when answers didn't come. When mercy steps aside, they are not forgotten. They are remembered, not with pity, but with promise. Because when God removes mercy from the proud, he surrounds the humble with protection. When the false peace of the wicked collapses, a true peace rises for the faithful. It's not always loud. Sometimes it's just a day where the heavy air lifts, a night where the tears don't come, a conversation where their name doesn't sting anymore. That's how God moves, subtly, then suddenly. When mercy steps aside, things begin to reverse. What was hidden is exposed. What was silenced is spoken. What was stolen is returned, but not always in the form you expected. Sometimes it's not about getting back what was taken. Sometimes it's about getting back yourself, your voice, your peace, your fire. God doesn't always restore what was lost. Sometimes he replaces it with something far greater. And those who lived high on borrowed grace, they begin to fade, slowly but certainly. The favor they wore like a crown vanishes. The charm that once fooled many begins to wear off. Doors close, words lose power, and behind it all heaven stands, not in revenge but in completion. What began in mercy ends in justice. You may never see their collapse televised. It may not happen in front of you, but make no mistake it happens, because no one escapes the moment when mercy steps aside. God sees what man ignores. He remembers what time forgets, and he will not be mocked. What was sown will be reaped. What was done in the dark will be dealt with in the light. So if you are the one who has been hurt, betrayed, overlooked, know this: you were never invisible. Mercy was shielding them, not forgetting you. But now the time has come, the shift has begun, and all those tears, those sleepless nights, those moments where you felt abandoned, they were not wasted. They were witnessed, and heaven has declared enough. Now mercy steps aside, and what comes next will not be stopped. The tearing down of false thrones, they built their thrones high, decorated them with lies, with manipulation, with stolen admiration. They sat on them with pride, speaking with the voices of kings, though their crowns were counterfeit. These were not thrones earned by sacrifice or righteousness, but built from the shattered pieces of other people's trust. Constructed in secret, maintained by fear and glorified by illusion, and for a while it worked. For a while they were applauded, envied, obeyed. They crafted stories around themselves, stories of power, of wisdom, of control. But all along, God was watching, not intervening, not interrupting, just watching, because he does not tear down until it is time, and when he says enough, the unravelling begins, not with thunder or fire, but with the quiet cracking of what was never solid to begin with. You see, God does not strike blindly. He does not tear down for drama. When he moves, it is surgical, precise, the kind of justice that doesn't just collapse a throne. It exposes what it was made of. And many of these thrones, these so-called empires built on charm and control, weren't made of strength at all. They were made of insecurity, masked with arrogance. They were propped up by the approval of others, fed by fear, and protected by silence. But God sees through it all. He sees the meetings behind closed doors, the whispered rumors, the subtle intimidation. He sees how the proud weaponized kindness turned love into leverage and used other people's loyalty as currency. These are the thrones he is not impressed by. These are the ones he will tear down, and it doesn't always look like disaster. Sometimes the fall is quiet. Sometimes the collapse begins with isolation. The people who once surrounded them begin to drift. The loyalty they demanded begins to fade. The charm they used to hypnotize now feels hollow. Opportunities dry up. Conversations grow shorter. Eyes begin to open. And the truth, which they buried under layers of charisma and manipulation, begins to breathe again. Because when God says enough, he doesn't just destroy a throne. He awakens the people who once bowed before it. False thrones rely on illusion. They rely on control. But control is not strength. Real strength inspires trust without demanding it. Real strength can stand alone. But false thrones collapse the moment their image is shattered. That's why the proud fear exposure more than anything, because they know deep down that their power only existed as long as no one looked too closely. And when God steps in, that's exactly what happens. Eyes are opened, minds are cleared, the fog lifts, and what once looked like royalty is revealed as fraud. You must understand this isn't just about individuals, it's about patterns. It's about systems. There are people who make a life out of stepping on others to rise higher. There are families, workplaces, even communities where one voice drowns out every other, where fear wears the mask of respect, where people are taught to shrink so someone else can feel big. But God doesn't operate in those spaces forever. He allows it for a season, not because he agrees with it, but because he is working behind the scenes, refining the hearts of the broken, strengthening the voices of the silenced, preparing the day when everything false must fall. And when that day comes, there is no warning, there is no chance to rebuild. The collapse is total, because when God removes his hand, the structure crumbles under its own weight. All the manipulation, the polished words, the theatrics, they cannot hold up when the favor of heaven is removed. And the fall is not just seen, it is felt in the quiet freedom of those who were once oppressed, felt in the relief of those who no longer have to pretend, felt in the sacred silence that follows when fear no longer holds the room hostage. But perhaps the most profound part of this fall is what happens afterward, not to the fallen, but to the survivors, the ones who endured beneath the weight of those false thrones, the ones who stayed silent to keep peace, the ones who were told they were too emotional, too difficult, too much. When the false thrones fall, those people rise, not with vengeance but with clarity, not with noise but with purpose. They rise because they were never meant to be subjects, they were meant to be free. And freedom tastes different when you've lived under oppression. It's not loud, it's not flashy, it's steady, it's sacred, and to those who fell, not out of humility but from deception, God gives no applause. He gives no sympathy to thrones built on cruelty. But even then, his justice is not for entertainment. He doesn't humiliate for sport. He humbles for truth. And sometimes the greatest mercy God gives a fallen ruler is the silence that follows their collapse. In that silence, they are left with themselves, no audience, no praise, just truth. And the truth, when finally faced, is heavier than any crown they wore. So let them fall. Let the false thrones be torn down, not by man's hands, but by divine decree. Let every title that was built on control be stripped away. Let every smile that hid cruelty dissolve. Let every lie that was protected by status be shattered. Because God is not mocked, and he is not indifferent. He may be silent, but he is not still. And when he says enough, he doesn't just end what was wrong, he begins what is right. In the ruins of those thrones, something beautiful happens, not immediately, not dramatically, but faithfully. The voices return, the laughter returns, the peace returns. The ones who were once bowed now stand taller, not in pride but in gratitude. They remember what it was like to be silenced, and they refuse to silence others. They remember what it felt like to be used, and they choose to serve instead. Because nothing teaches true leadership like surviving false ones. This is how heaven restores, not by patching up broken systems, but by tearing them down and rebuilding with truth. So if you've watched someone build a throne out of your pain, out of your silence, out of your loyalty, take heart. They may still be sitting on it today, but the cracks are forming, the foundation is hollow. And heaven has not forgotten. When the time is right, that throne will fall, and when it does, you won't have to raise your voice. You won't have to fight for justice, because the architect of justice is already on his way. And when he comes, nothing false will remain. Standing the lifting of the humble, they were never in the spotlight. Their names were rarely spoken with admiration. They weren't the loudest in the room, the most powerful, or the most praised. In fact, they were often overlooked, quiet figures in the background of louder, more aggressive stories. They were the ones who kept giving when it wasn't returned, who chose peace over pride, who forgave without applause. Not because they were weak, but because their strength came from a deeper place, a place unseen by crowds but fully known to God. And while others rose by climbing over people, they kept their heads down and their hearts clean. These are the humble, and when God says enough, these are the ones he lifts. You see, humility isn't silence out of fear, it's silence rooted in wisdom. It knows that not every battle needs to be fought with words. It knows when to step back, when to stay still, when to trust that heaven sees what man ignores. The humble are not naive. They are just not interested in showmanship. They endure pain, betrayal, manipulation, and loneliness, not because they enjoy it, but because they refuse to trade their soul for validation. And for a time, it looks like they're losing. It looks like their goodness is wasted. But God does not measure time the way we do. He lets humility mature in the shadows, and then, without warning, he lifts. The lifting of the humble is not a spectacle. It's not the world's version of revenge. It's not about proving people wrong. It's about revealing what was right all along. It happens slowly sometimes. One door opens, then another. One burden lifts, then another. People start to see them differently. Opportunities that once passed them by suddenly stop and look. Their voice, once dismissed, begins to carry weight. It's not magic, it's timing, divine timing. Because when God lifts the humble, no one can stop it. No reputation, destroyer, no false accusation, no whisper campaign can compete with the favor of the Almighty. And here's the truth, the humble were always strong. They just weren't loud about it. They stayed when it would have been easier to leave. They loved when it would have been justified to hate. They carried pain quietly, gracefully. They prayed through sleepless nights, walked through days of being misunderstood, and still chose to bless rather than curse. They weren't perfect, no, but they were faithful. Faithful to what they knew was right. Faithful to kindness. Faithful to integrity. That faithfulness does not go unnoticed by heaven. In fact, it is treasured. And when God begins to move on their behalf, the shift is not subtle. It is undeniable. The same people who once overlooked them begin to wonder how they've come this far, how they have peace without bitterness, how they carry themselves with dignity despite what they've been through. That's the signature of divine elevation. It's not boastful, but it cannot be ignored, because God lifts in such a way that people have to ask. And when they ask, the answer is never about revenge. It's about grace, grace that kept them grounded, grace that shielded them from becoming what they hated, grace that let them walk away from false thrones without needing to destroy them, grace that quietly whispered, "Wait, your time will come." And now it's here. When the humble are lifted, it is not at the expense of others. God doesn't need to humiliate one person to honor another. But he does bring justice, and sometimes justice looks like repositioning. Those who misused their influence are removed from places they never respected, and those who served faithfully, quietly, without corruption, those people are lifted, not because they demanded it, but because they were ready for it. The time in the shadows taught them compassion. The long wait developed patience. The wounds refined their discernment. So when they are lifted, they don't repeat the mistakes of those who came before. They lead with humility because they were shaped by humility. You may have seen them, the ones who held families together without recognition, the ones who stayed in toxic environments just to protect the ones they loved, the ones who gave up dreams so others could chase theirs, the ones who listened when no one else did. These people didn't have titles or applause, but when God says enough, they are the ones he honors. And the honor doesn't always come in the form of fame or fortune. Sometimes it's a restoration of joy. Sometimes it's a new beginning that no one saw coming. Sometimes it's peace that cannot be shaken. And other times, it's the simple but powerful vindication of being seen. And oh, how the humble deserve to be seen, not by the crowd, but by their Creator, and he sees every quiet sacrifice, every unseen act of kindness, Every moment they held back words that could have destroyed someone. Every time they chose the high road, not because it was easy, but because it was right. God sees all of it, and his lifting is personal. It's tailored. It's not a general reward. It's a divine response to every specific tear, every silent prayer, every broken heart they carried without complaint. And what happens next? Once they are lifted, they don't become like the ones who once stepped on them. They don't rule with iron fists or bitterness. No, the lifted humble become safe spaces. They become mentors, protectors, warriors of quiet justice. They carry authority not with pride, but with responsibility, because they remember. They remember what it felt like to be down there, and they reach back. They help others rise. They build, not empires of ego, but sanctuaries of strength. They speak life. They plant peace. They bless even when no one is watching, because that's who they've always been. If you are one of them, if you've walked through the fire, not with fury but with faith, your time is near. You've been faithful in the small things. You've been misunderstood, misjudged, perhaps even betrayed. But you've stayed the course, and heaven has taken note. You don't need to fight for a seat at the table. When God lifts you, he doesn't just bring a chair. He builds a whole new room. So stay steady, stay kind, stay humble, because the same God who let you walk through quiet valleys is now preparing to lift you in ways you never imagined. Not because you forced it, not because you deserved it, but because you were faithful when it hurt. And when God says enough, the low are brought high, not to boast, but to bless. The turning point no one saw coming, it always comes quietly. Not with trumpets or fire from the sky, not with flashing headlines or roaring crowds, but with a shift, subtle at first, then unmistakable. The turning point, that sacred, invisible line where everything begins to change. No one sees it coming, not even those who have prayed for it. It arrives like the dawn, unhurried, unannounced, but unstoppable. And when it comes, it doesn't just change circumstances. It redefines lives. It moves silently past the loud ones, the proud ones, the ones who thought they were untouchable. It skips past the stage and touches the soul. Because when God says enough, this is what follows, a turning point no one could have predicted, and no force on earth can stop. For so long, it looked like nothing was happening. The pain dragged on, the injustice lingered, the prayers seemed to echo into silence. It felt like a cycle with no exit, like the darkness had taken root and grown vines around everything good. But heaven was not still. Heaven was working, quietly, strategically, setting things in motion that no eye could see, rearranging hearts, redirecting paths, softening the hardened and strengthening the weary. Because when God acts, he doesn't just fix the moment. He transforms the foundation. He rebuilds what we didn't even know was broken, and the turning point begins. This turning point doesn't always start with a miracle. Sometimes it starts with a conversation, a decision, a moment of clarity after years of confusion. Sometimes it's a sudden peace you can't explain. Sometimes it's the strength to finally walk away from what once held you hostage, or the wisdom to forgive without being asked. These are not random. They are divine signatures, evidence that heaven is drawing a line, not in anger, but in justice, not to punish, but to correct, not to destroy, but to realign. Because the turning point is not revenge. It is restoration. It is redemption. It is the moment when what was wrong begins to lose its grip, and what is right starts rising. It is the season when liars lose their audience, manipulators lose their influence, and truth finds its voice again. It is when the first become last, and the last begin to rise, not because they demanded it, but because they endured for it. The turning point is sacred, not a spectacle, but a shift. a holy rearrangement of everything that once seemed permanent. And make no mistake, it is not just a shift in the external world. It is a transformation within you. Suddenly, the pain no longer owns you. The past no longer defines you. The fear no longer controls you. You start to see differently, walk differently, speak differently, not because your enemies vanished, but because your perspective changed. You've been refined in the fire. You've been made strong in the silence. You've been trained in endurance, in faith, in resilience, and now you walk into rooms without needing validation. You walk out of toxic spaces without guilt. You no longer apologize for growing. That is the turning point. That is what heaven was preparing you for. And for those who watched your struggle, who thought your silence was weakness, who mistook your patience for permission, they are now confused. They don't understand how the one they tried to control is no longer afraid, how the one they tried to shame now speaks with clarity, how the one they left behind kept rising. That's the power of God's turning point. It doesn't come to announce your greatness. It comes to fulfill His promise, a promise that says, you will not stay where they left you. You will not live in the shadow of what hurt you. You will walk in the light of who you are becoming. This is not about ego. It's about alignment. It's about finally standing in the place that was always meant for you, but took pain, loss, and perseverance to reach. It's about finally becoming what your trials were shaping you into. A voice that cannot be silenced. A heart that cannot be manipulated, a soul that has made peace with its past and is no longer chained to it. That's the turning point. That's what no one saw coming, not even you, and perhaps that's the beauty of it. You weren't striving for this. You weren't plotting revenge or planning a comeback. You were surviving, healing, waiting, hoping, and that is exactly what qualified you. Your stillness, your trust, your quiet refusal to give up even when everything screamed that you should. Heaven noticed, and now what was once a battlefield becomes a platform, not to show off, but to speak truth, not to dominate, but to liberate. You become the testimony others didn't know they needed, a walking, breathing reminder that delay is not denial, and silence is not abandonment. For some, this turning point will be external. New doors, restored relationships, unexpected blessings. For others it will be deeply internal, the return of joy, the end of torment, the lifting of a heaviness they forgot how to live without. But either way it will come, because when God says enough, it is not just the end of injustice. It is the beginning of divine realignment. Things start falling into place, not all at once, but in ways so precise, so personal, you know it could only be heaven. And to those still waiting for it, take heart. Just because you don't see the shift doesn't mean it's not happening. Some breakthroughs are born in silence. Some victories are hidden until the moment they bloom. But they are coming, not because of who you are, but because of whose you are. You are not forgotten. You are not invisible. You are not weak. You are simply being positioned. Every disappointment was a redirection. Every betrayal was a removal. Every closed door was protection. And now comes the turning point. When it comes, don't question it. Don't shrink from it. Don't apologize for it. Walk in it, own it. Thank God for it, because it didn't come from people. It came from purpose, and no man can close what God has opened. No lie can stand where truth has taken root. No enemy can sit where heaven has declared your seat. This is the hour of reversal, the time when things that seemed stuck for years begin to move, the time when quiet tears turn into shouts of joy, when wandering souls find home, when forgotten dreams find breath again. You didn't miss it. You didn't lose it. It's been coming all along. You were being shaped for it, and now it's here. The turning point no one saw coming has finally arrived.